look at my time so that I am able to time myself. And so basically, I want to focus on Africa. And currently, there's a financing gap of about $68 to 108 billion in Africa. This means that the money that we require for us to build hospitals, to build our roads, to improve on infrastructure that is critical, for example, the provision of water, we need about 68 to 108 billion currently within Africa. And the UN has actually said, if we are able to bridge the financing gap, we can be able to grow the GDP per capita per year to about 2.6% across the African continent. And therefore, being able to bridge this gap is critical. And there are several options in how this can be done. And for us to cover that funding gap, we can, for example, within African countries, receive more aid. But even as we speak about receiving more aid, we must say that aid has currently been dwindling over the years. In fact, as at 2016-2017, statistics show that for most countries, aid has reduced by 3.6% per year in most countries. That's option one. Option two is do the traditional way of borrowing from the multilateral institutions. However, things are changing now. Multilateral institutions are asking African countries or most countries in developing nations to do more for them to be able to receive funding. Domestically, we also have resistance to more funding from multilateral institutions. Most recently, when, for example, the IMF extended more funding to Kenya, within civil society is saying no, do not continue extending more funding to the government because number one, we are reducing, there's reduced transparency in how some of these deals are negotiated. In addition, some of this money, even after it has been received, we cannot keep track of it. We cannot say where it went. And therefore, we are left with another option, increased consumption taxes. And these are the VATs. And these are the taxes that hurt individuals directly. So when we tax our fuel, for example, when we tax bread, when we impose more sin tax, when we tax goods that are necessary, that are consumed daily, we are hurting the individuals or the members of the public directly. So that is option three. It's a hard option. Option four is grow our economy, have more industrialization in each of our economies, grow our exports. And I put some examples that for a country that has about 98 million citizens, a country like Ethiopia, they have a surplus in beef. Some of these beef, if there is a necessary certification, it can be exported to other countries that need it. And that can grow our export, that can grow the exports. A country like Kenya that has a huge horticulture industry, if we are able to increase our horticulture exports, the avocados, the flowers, that is growth in exports. That is an opportunity to grow our economy. And once we are able to grow our to grow economies, the African economies, we can be able to reduce on some of the ways that I proposed above. For example, we can be able to reduce the over-reliance on consumption taxes. We can be able to reduce the over-reliance on debt, especially from multilateral institutions and other debtors that I will talk about as we go along. The other option for bridging the gap is to explore public-private partnerships. And even before we go further, I want to say that if you look at the options available for covering the funding gap, we can be able to say, we can say that this is like being asked to choose your poison wisely, because each of the available ways through which we can plug in the gap is dangerous. It is not good for our economies. it affects citizens directly. And therefore, for most developing nations, the options available to cover the funding gap is like being asked to choose your poison wisely. How long will it take for your economy to grow, implode, or affect us? And this is where PPP comes in. And I want to say that the private sector, especially in Africa, it has a huge role in contributing to the economic development of the nations. And I gave an example here that, for example, 20% of the power needs in Nigeria are currently being produced by one company, Transcorp, through a PPP. And if a country that has been struggling that much can have an agreement that avails about 20% of the power needs of the country through a public-private partnership, then that simply means that there is indeed a huge opportunity for the private sector to contribute towards the economic development of the nations through sustainable models or through models such as PPP. And most current existing PPP projects, they cover several areas. One is the renewable energy sector, that is geothermal, wind, and all that. We also have power generation, and power generation can be, for example, from hydro, the dams that we use to produce hydropower. We also have other models where we have health and communications, and we will see examples as we go along. And some of the PPPs currently in existence within Africa, in Ivory Coast, we have the bridge that they call the Henry Konan Bridge. In Kenya, we have a huge project, the Lake Turkana wind project that is being implemented through PPP. We also have several power and water projects in Ghana, Nigeria, and Rwanda. And these are just examples of the PPPs at work. There's a huge reliance, as you will see, on infrastructure. So the roads, the generation of power, there's a huge over-reliance on, or rather PPPs are currently biased towards providing critical infrastructure. And how does the PPP financing model look like? What is the typology of a PPP financing model? There are several ways through which the government and the private sector enter into contracts. The most prevalent one is the first one that we call the BOT, where we build, operate, transfer. And BOT here denotes that a private sector company is given a project, for example, a port or a road, and then they will build the road. And after they build the road, they have factored into the model a way through which they can recoup the capital. And so they operate and collect tolls, for example. And in collecting the tolls or collecting some money, they recoup the initial investment that they put in. And therefore, that's why we call it the build, operate to recoup your initial investment or your initial capital. And once you have recouped your initial capital, and then you transfer back to government to continue operating that, that investment. And this is where the issues now arise, because there are several questions, and we shall be looking at some of the challenges of what this denotes. So for example, what are the tariff agreements that we have in place to ensure that during the time that the private sector entity is operating the infrastructure, it does not overexploit the market. So it does not, for example, levy too much money in a way that it affects citizens for them to be able to recoup the profit. So the company may levy too high, a levy that is too high, because they, for example, want to reduce the period within which they recoup their initial investment. And by doing that, they are passing on the burden to the citizens, which may not be a good thing. We also have another model, which is the build, own, operate. So this is like a finality. So once you build, you own it as a private entity and you operate it into infinity. We also have the DBF rather, where the company, a private entity, designs and then it builds and looks for the finances for it to be able to sustain or build whatever infrastructure it is building. We also have others like DBFO or DBFOM, where the private entity designs, it builds, it finances, it operates, and it manages. This is like the full breadth, where you have a private entity coming in, designing, looking for the finances, operating it, and then managing it. So these are simply some of the typologies of how a PPP model looks like. And now we move back to DRM. What does an effective DRM system require? One of the main requirements is a tax base. And a tax base here can mean, one, the people. How many people are taxpayers within an economy? So if you take Uganda as an example, how many people within the economy are able to pay tax? That's the tax base. Effective DRM also requires that we have legislation or the laws that are implementable. So we do not come up with laws that are hard or impossible to be able to levy the necessary taxes. And remember, when we spoke about the choices that African countries have currently, we denoted it into poison. Choose our poison wisely. Like, so what options do they have? And for any nation, for any country to be able to have a DRM system that is effective, then the tax base is important. And apart from the people, a tax base also denotes the organizations. It denotes the corporations that are operating within the nation or within the country, and the ability of the government to be able to charge or to levy taxes upon those organizations or the corporates. And this is where the issues arise. Because corporations by their nature have certain abilities to be able to ensure that at the end of the day, they make more profit than loss. At the end of the day, corporations often want to pay less tax than they ought to pay. And the proponents of PPP argue that, number one, the private sector, by having a strong private sector, we increase liquidity within an economy. So for example, even though resources are dwindling within our economies or within our countries, by the private sector coming in, we can have more resources available. And as we increase liquidity within an economy, we also, proponents of PPP say that PPP also enhances efficiency. And often the examples that are given here are of the US system, because they were, most proponents will say that within the US system, roads, the best pipelines were built by a private sector. They built them more quickly, they built them more efficiently, and they operated them more efficiently than government could have done. So by the time the government came to take over most of the PPP projects, we had an efficient operated railway, where we had an efficient and well-operated pipeline. And so proponents will say that often the private sector, because it is driven by a model that requires them to make profit and make profit within a short time, there's efficiency. There's also efficiency because the private sector does not want to spend a lot of money. So they will look for the easiest way to implement or do a project. But on the flip side, government is said to be wasteful. The government is saying not to, to do things more quickly. So a road that could have been built within a shorter time takes a longer time because of the question of who is holding the purse, who is holding the finances. The other thing that proponents of PPP say is that by availing resources for critical infrastructure from the private sector, we create fiscal room for the government to be able to invest in other critical areas. So where a government is, for example, not required to build a port, they have more resources that they can use to build a hospital. And I think that is a valid argument, that by creating that fiscal room, then the government does not need to invest in those areas. They can invest in the other areas that really require or rather impact on the lives of citizens. And the other thing I would want us to look at is the cyclical nature of public-private partnerships, or PPPs. When investors come into a country, they are looking for stability. That's one. Number two, they are concerned about the legal system. Does the legal system work for them? Are there laws that protect their investment? Are there laws that enable the quick resolution of debt? Are there laws that also protect the people that work in those companies? The other thing, investors also look for good infrastructure. I was reading the story of a well-known company that makes biscuits. Their headquarters are based somewhere in Southeast Asia, but they have an African hub based in South Africa. And they were saying, because of the infrastructure, good infrastructure available in South Africa, they spend at least less than half of the amount of money they spend in their headquarters. So in short, to say that by that company, they are able to produce more efficiently in South Africa than they are able to do it in their home country. So good infrastructure is a key consideration for any investor. Investors also look for countries that provide lower taxes. And that is why in the international financial architecture, most corporations have been domiciling themselves in places where they know that they will pay less tax. Domiciling does not necessarily mean that this is where they are operating from. So you will find a company operating in another country, but domiciled in a country that promises them lower taxes. If you flip that over, PPPs can actually address some of the areas that investors are looking out for. For example, we say that there's a current bias for PPPs to focus on building infrastructure. Building infrastructure creates a good environment for investment. And by having a good environment for investment, then you have more money, more liquidity flowing into an economy, you have job creation, and you have the opportunity for the local market to grow. And therefore, there's that cyclical nature that PPPs provide the necessary environment for the investors to come in. But remember, it is also the investors who also come in to do the same thing. So the investors come in to bring in the better infrastructure, and others come in to benefit from the infrastructure that has been established. The other thing that I mentioned is that one of the other things that PPPs does is that it eases the burden on the government. And so the government is able to focus on providing the most critical services. So for example, where we reduce the disease burden in a country, we create a better workforce that can be able to feed into the companies that are coming in to invest. But where the disease burden is too big, infrastructure is wanting, we have a shrinking economy, then that just creates a bad environment for everything. And so therefore, PPPs and investment, they are mutually interdependent. There's that cyclical reliance on each other. I hope we are flowing together. I know that we will be able to gauge whether we are following at the end of it, but I hope we are flowing together. I wanted to problematize PPPs or look at some of the challenges with PPPs. Of course, I have a bias and I have therefore looked at some of the challenges with PPPs within Africa. And this is where the problem starts. The government wants to provide services, but the private sector entity that is coming in wants to make profit. So you have this division between interests, where the government would want a good road, but the private sector is interested in how quickly can we make the money. If we build a road, how quickly can we recoup our initial capital investment? That's one. Number two, for example, you will have the government wanting to provide electricity, and therefore, because it doesn't have the necessary resources to invest in the generation of power, they will give it to independent power producers. The independent power producers, through the PPP model, will want to make more profit within that short time. And because of those questions, then you will find that though we are producing power in a country like Kenya, where we are producing a lot of power that can be able to cover at least 60 to 70% of our power needs, the cost of that power is so high because there's a huge reliance on the private sector to produce that power. So during that period when they are producing power and they want to recoup their initial investment, then you have tariffs that are too high and they are affecting the ability of the citizens, for example, to be able to invest in industrialization because the power tariffs are too high. So the government wants to provide services, the private sector wants profits. And I here give the story of one foundation that has, for example, from 2013, for the next 15 years, if you are 2013, about 15 years, that goes to about 2028, about 9 billion to fight diseases in Africa. However, this same foundation over quite a long period has been one of the major investors in coal that causes problems, in oil and gas companies in Africa. So, you look at it from both sides and you wonder, so over this period, though we will have money to, cater for the disease burden, it is the same foundation through their profit-making model that could have contributed to some of the health issues that we have within the nations. The other question also is the power imbalance. You have an investor that comes in with the money, that's the capital. They come in with a skilled manpower. They have a market in some instances. And at the end of the day, you have a government that needs that money. You have a government that needs to provide services. You have a politician somewhere who wants to prove that during their time in power, they did something for the country. And remember, they need to negotiate because we are calling it a PPP, it's a partnership. Where we have a partnership that is built on an equal power, then it becomes harder to negotiate for an equal playing ground because you have this private investor coming in with all the knowledge, all the skills, all the technology. On the government side, you probably do not have the equal ability to negotiate. You do not have the power to be able to, put walls and say, if you don't do this, we will not do this. But the private investor has all that power from within themselves. And therefore, when you think about the power imbalance of these PPPs, then you're able to see that they portend a big problem for most African nations. The other issue is the inadequate legal frameworks. I didn't mention that. Yes, please.
I saw a hand up from Kirsten Nicholas. I don't know if their question still stands or comment.
Yeah, maybe I can go through and then we'll just do the questions together.
Okay.
Yes. That's okay, Grace?
Yes, that's okay.
Okay. Just about to finish with my presentation, and then we'll create time for. I hope everyone is following, and we are just looking at the challenges now. We looked at the imbalance of power and the needs of the government vis-a-vis the needs of the private entity. But the other thing I mentioned is that when an investor comes in, they're looking for certainty and stability in a country, because they remember any investment must have in mind the question of risk. What are we risking? Are we risking that we might not be able to recoup our investment? And therefore, at that point, if a country does not have adequate legal frameworks that protect the relationship between the government and the investor, then there are issues. But on the other side, if the legal framework is so deficient that it simply opens the door for the investor to come in and do as they wish and take away resources as they wish and exploit citizens as they wish, then we have an issue. And therefore, legal frameworks need to be, certain, they need to provide stability, but they also need to provide for the ability of the government to protect the interests of the citizens. In most countries, we do not even have PPP frameworks, and that's a huge issue. Secondly, it's the political considerations. Most PPP negotiations create opportunities for rent seeking for those that are doing the negotiation. And therefore, certain interests can be compromised because of the rents that are available during the point of negotiations. Because remember, any investor wants quick sign-off. So if they can be able to bend the discretion of those they are negotiating with, then there's a huge problem there. The other question about the challenge of PPP is the instability of our political systems. That where we have change of government in about 5 years or in about 10 years, that change of government could portend a huge risk for those that would want to invest in PPPs within our countries. And therefore, political considerations become a huge issue. I put corruption here, not as a placeholder, because I know that in most challenges, we always put corruption there as a challenge. But I put it there because even those that come to invest are also concerned about corruption. I've read the story of one major investor in Africa who was unable to invest in a country because of the huge demand for bribes that he was being asked to give. And therefore, even those that come to engage in PPP negotiations and investments, they're also concerned about the corruption levels. The other thing about PPPs is the limited market. So for example, if we have an investor that is investing in power generation, he needs to be assured that there's enough market for power, and not just the market, but the ability of the market to be able to pay for the power that is generated, and so that they can be able to recoup their initial profit, the initial capital. And therefore, where we have limited spending power within citizens, then that creates a smaller opportunity for those that would want to invest, for them to be able to recoup their initial investment. The other question is, where we build a port, for example, or we build a road, and over the initial period, we say that during that period, the investor will be able to recoup their initial profit. What about the period thereafter? In short, what is the cost-benefit analysis of a PPP project over its lifetime? Whether it's a port, whether it's a hydrogeothermal energy dam, whether it is what we do by generating geothermal energy using PPP models, over that period when they explore power for 15 years, recoup their initial profit, then exit that area. What is the cost analysis of that project over its lifetime? And the other concern is also that private entities, they have certain peculiarities within themselves. So a private company can, for example, be able to hide who its real owners are. And I have seen instances where independent power producers in most nations are companies that are owned by the people who are in the government power generation companies, who through proxy or through complicated ownership structures own these independent power producing companies, and are therefore involved in two ways: in negotiating for what tariffs ought to be paid, but also on the other side, benefiting from those projects. So by having this peculiarity, the ability to hide who the real owner is, then there's a huge problem. The other issue is complicated accounting systems, concealment of records, tax evasion, and ensuring that as a private entity, if we invest, we ensure that we avoid as much tax as possible? So huge question. Therefore, as I finish, PPPs as they are, if we look at the models, they portend a big challenge because we need them. We need them because we need to reduce the tax burden on ordinary citizens. We need them because we need to increase infrastructure within our countries. We need them because for us to be able to avail enough money for the government to invest in other critical areas, then we must increase the ability of the private sector to, to contribute to the growth of the economy, so that during that period, when government is relieved of the burden of investing in roads and other things, they can be able to invest in health, provision of water, and the other most important considerations for a country. And therefore, we are damned if we don't engage in PPPs. We are also damned if we engage in PPPs, because as I mentioned, most of these companies, they are profit-oriented. They want to pay less tax. They want to ensure that at the end of the day, they do not lose money. They also want to ensure that there's some political stability in between. And therefore, rent-seeking behavior is there. So damned if we don't do, damned if we do. Thank you. Back to you, Grace.
Thank you very much, Francis. I think that was a very informative session for all of us. At least it was on my end. Just in case anyone has any comments or any questions, please raise your hand, or you're free to type them in the chat box. I think I saw a comment from Evelyn, and she was saying, I agree that rent seeking should be a key factor that has made Uganda suffer with umeme concession. That's why even the head of state is wondering who signed the contract. And there was also another comment from Lanmo, who was saying, based on the current slide, means we are at crossroads. That came in, I think, while the presentation was going on. Those seem to be the only two comments I see. John, I see your hand is up. Yes, John. John? John, you're still muted in case you are speaking. I see your hand is up.
Yeah, maybe as we wait for John, Evelyn.
There was also a hand earlier on from Kirsten. Not sure, Kirsten Nicholas, not sure if he still would like to ask his question or make his comment. But in the meantime, you could respond to Evelyn's comment.
Yeah, Evelyn, this is very true. And this is how it works. When a public, or rather a private entity, a company, wants to engage in a project or a PPP project, there's often the question of who approaches the other. Is it that the government approaches this PPP, or rather this private entity, or is it that the private entity that approaches the government with a solution? In most instances, it is the private entity that will approach government. I'll give you an example. Most of the telecommunication companies currently operating in most nations are operating through this model. of PPP. And most of them, they are doing through joint venture, which is another model that I didn't mention. So apart from build, operate, transfer, and the other models that I mentioned, we also have the joint ventures where the government becomes a shareholder in some of these entities. So the government holds a certain amount of shares. The government could be a minority shareholder, or the government could also be a majority shareholder. And this is now where the dynamics often start having problems or start changing, because who will be at the round table discussing whether we do a BOT or we do a build, a DBOT, so design, build, operate, transfer, or we do a design, build, finance, operate, transfer. Who sits at that table and what interest do they represent? When we, in Kenya, when we were having one of the major telecommunication companies coming in, one of the issues that happened is that we had, during those negotiations, the government becoming a majority shareholder, yes, but there was also an entity whose owners have never been known to date that also became a shareholder of that entity during the negotiations with government. This entity, which was a private company, which was not the main investor, was given shares because it was said to be the broker between the telecoms company and the government. So during those negotiations, they were given a bit of shareholding. And the issue here was, so does this shareholding also mean that they partake in the profits? Yes. Why are they partaking in the profits? Simply by being the broker? Then these are the questions. And the other main issue is, so who was the owner of that company? This small entity that was given some bit of shareholding. That's the question. This company was not registered in Kenya. It was registered in a tax haven. And by being registered in a tax haven, also denotes that there's also a degree of secrecy as to who the owners of that company are. So for about 5 or 6 years, this shadowy entity was a major shareholder, also received part of the profits that were made by the entrance of this company into the telecoms industry within Kenya. And this is where rent seeking comes in, because they are probably political holders of that company or the owners of that company. Maybe this was just a front for collecting the rents and then distributing them to the people that need that rent. And rent here, we are just calling it rent, but it means what we all know as corruption. And therefore, this is where the rent-seeking behavior becomes a major problem during the discussions for PPPs. So that's indeed a major issue. But in addition to that, I also wanted to say that the imbalance in knowledge, skills, and technology. So who sits at the table and what knowledge do they have? This can be said to be true of both things, whether it is, for example, when we are negotiating tax treaties or when we are negotiating with companies about the PPPs. Who sits at that table and what knowledge do they have? Do they, for example, understand their bill, or rather who the owners of the company that is coming to invest are, where that capital is coming from, and what process, the process in between the investment and the recouping of that profit. So that imbalance in knowledge and skill causes huge issues, because the investors will come in with the best tax negotiators. They will come in with the best legal negotiators. They will come in with the best advisors on business models. Do we have an equal playing field within government? Because remember, there's also that, protectionism within government, that one agency does not want to talk with the other agency. So one agency will negotiate or agree that by the time, for example, the Attorney General's office is coming in, they're already late to the party. Certain agreements have been made that are not beneficial to the interests of the country. So rent seeking is indeed a huge issue. Is there another question?
Yes, there was a comment from Julius Arugu, and he says, now that we have seen the challenges of the PPPs, should governments continue to engage with private sector that seems to be more powerful than our governments? And there was one on the rent sinking behavior by Renee, and he's saying, how is rent sinking monster handled in other East African countries? And what mitigation measures have been adopted by government to control or curb the vice? Then there was also a question from Julius Arugu, and he's asking, what is the percentage of sharing the profits between government and private sector or multinational corporations? And I see Joanne's hand is still up and her microphone was muted. Maybe she can ask her question. Or it seems to be off again. And there was a comment from Evelyn. Most PPPs are co-financed through, most PPPs are co-financed by taxpayers' money, with governments being guarantors of loans used by private sector in PPPs, in these PPPs arrangements. And then another comment from Penina, and she's saying, thank you for the well-put presentation, very insightful. I agree on the challenges with PPPs mentioned. We also need to consider the foreign exchange used can be a challenge on developing countries, depending on the negotiation made between the government and the private sector. This would put high pressure on government to pay back and added pressure on the citizens to pay more taxes. How best can this be worked upon to avoid developing countries from losing more than gaining, especially in these negotiations? Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll go through the comments of the chat or the questions. Whether, now that we have seen the challenges, whether to continue or what to do. And that's why I brought back this slide, that we are damned if we don't, and damned if we do. That we need infrastructure, because if we have infrastructure, we can be able to grow our GDPs by at least 2.6% for each country within Africa. So I think that's a big question. Secondly, we have a huge financing gap. We did say that it is in its billions, I think $180 billion. We have that gap. The options for plugging that gap are reduced, they are less, because it is either we tax our citizens more heavily by imposing more consumption taxes, or we borrow as we have always borrowed, which now leads to another huge problem of increased public debt. And because of those questions, then I think that PPPs create a better model for us to be able to bridge the financing gap and for us to be able to build the critical infrastructure that is required in most countries. And therefore, I think there is space for the private sector to continue contributing to the growth of the economies of developing countries. That's Julius. The rent-seeking monster in other East African countries, and what mitigation measures have been adopted by government to control, curb the device, or rather the vice. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I will say this because most of these deals are shrouded in mystery. We do not know who the companies are, who the owners are, which contracts they enter into with government, what period, for example, will they be operating, what tariffs have they agreed on with government? And therefore, this is where transparency, sunlight, is a huge question. If we have more transparency, so for example, within civil society, we can be able to look at the contracts that have been negotiated, and maybe by looking at them, we can be able to give advice, or we can be able to give our input and say, this is not right, or this is right. And therefore, sunlight, let us have more transparency during the times when these PPPs are being negotiated. In most instances, though they are called PPPs, you also have government-backed private entities. And this has mostly been seen with Chinese and Japanese companies, where it is a private entity, yes, but it is backed by the government. And therefore, there is even more imbalance, because the government that is backing this private entity is also holding the purse, is holding the money. And so if we don't, as a country, agree to some of the arm twisting that we are getting from the private entity, then we lose the goodwill from the government that is backing this private entity. And therefore, that is another huge question. Who backs the private entities when they come to us? And I think there has also been a very good comment that has also underlined where does the money come from to finance the PPPs? Some of it comes from government. So our government also contributes, and these are the resources that we are taxed. But we also have private entities that provide debt that is then used to finance the PPP models. We also have multilateral institutions. AFDB has also been one of the major supporters of PPPs within Africa. And where the money comes from is also a huge question, because if the money does not come from an entity that requires transparency, then there will be issues with transparency. If the money does not come from an entity that requires certain safeguards, for example, environmental safeguards. So even as we build, even as we invest in infrastructure, what are our environmental safeguards? If we do not have those questions there, then the financing that we receive for PPP to finance the PPP model actually becomes more poisonous than if we had not done. And therefore, I think that's a huge question there. The percentage of sharing the profits between government and private sector. Good question, because these are things that ought to be written into the PPP contract before it is signed. And therefore, we agree as an independent power producer, as Umeme, for example, as you produce power, how are we going to be sharing the profits? And is it a percentage or is it an absolute figure? Is it denominated in local currency or is it denominated in dollar? Huge questions. Because if these things are not, these safeguards are not placed into our contracts, then there's a huge problem. Often, the company that is investing, the private entity, because of the need for stability, they will not agree to have some of these figures placed into the contract. And because these contracts remain a mystery and they remain shrouded and hidden behind government doors and behind government lockers, then we cannot question. I have seen that in some of the best PPP agreements, the government receives a profit that is not less than 20% from the investment. And this is for a short period, during the period when the investor is recouping the initial investment. And then the profit must keep increasing as the agency is making more money and as they are recouping their profit. And therefore, at the time of closing off the deal, when the project is coming back to the government, then there ought to be more money, or rather the profit ought to have risen. But the other question then is the cost of maintaining the infrastructure. Do we have certain safeguards that ensure that these costs are not too high or they are not exaggerated to an extent of reducing the profits? Because this is what happens in most PPP agreements, that the cost of operating is sometimes exaggerated and made too high that it becomes even impossible to calculate the amount of profit that is due to the government and that is due to a country. So that's a huge question. The question of how much are we spending on operating that infrastructure? Background before and during the discussions. Yes, due diligence. How much due diligence do we do as a government or as a country before we sign on to PPPs with private entities? Because some of these private entities may be driven by people behind them that are not very clean. They may be obtaining resources or money that is not very clean. And so by bringing in those players within our economies, we are complicating the equations for ourselves. Where do the negotiations for these agreements happen? If I am the private investor and I am interested in getting a quick deal from government, from the people that have power within government, they take them to Dubai, they take them to Hong Kong, and they book them into nice, nice rooms, and they would, they'll be given, tours of other projects that this private investor has engaged in. They will be given opportunities to interact with the financials of the project. And that is a huge question. Where do the negotiations happen? Because if they happen in boardrooms outside of our country, then there's a huge question. Who participates? What skills do they bring to the table? Who does the government rely on for the advice on whether to proceed with these deals or not? Those questions are huge and they're important. Well-connected political and private sector honchos, very true, and state machinery. I mentioned an investor here who is a well-known independent power producer, IPP. And as the independent power producer, if you check behind who owns that independent power producer, they are the people who have been in these government agencies that are responsible for the same thing. And so you have this connivance, you have this unholy deal between those that are in government and those that need to make profit. Or rather, you could even have people from government who have realized that for us to make more profit, let us approach government through a PPP model so that the money that could have gone to government goes to a private entity. So those unholy deals are rife and they're everywhere. And this is where I said, with more sunlight, we can be able to know who is behind these deals. Foreign exchange, this is a huge question, because when we negotiate a deal, do we denominate it in our local currency or do we denominate it in dollars? Of course, most private companies will say it has to be dollar denominated because of what? The main question that we raised there before of stability, that when an investor comes in, they're also interested in stability. And therefore they will say dollar denominated, but we must run away from these dollar denominated deals, because the question here begs, are we making this money in dollars or in our local currency? Because if we are paying our tolls in local currency, if we are paying for power in local currency, if we are paying for the use of port facilities in local currency, then why are we paying for that debt in dollar denomination? Huge question. And this is where the losses come in. John, I think you said you'll be ready. So I'll answer this question and then you can come in. How can corrupt and tax evading private sector help improve efficiency in government through PPP? A huge question there. That it's a private entity. It wants to evade tax. It wants to make much profit, and they're also not clean. How can they improve efficiency? I say that the people that have been huge proponents of PPP look at models like South Africa, which South Africa is well known as a country that can be said to be a success on PPPs, good roads, power generation, hospitals are doing well. We have enough infrastructure in the country. Industrialization is also a huge question. We have had success, but on the flip side, we have also had a fair share of people within government. Some have actually been prosecuted successfully for engaging with these private entities through rent seeking and other behaviors of being corrupt. However, I'll keep referring to my last slide, that we are damned if we don't do. We are also damned if we do. And therefore the question is, maybe because of our limited opportunities or our limited chances on how we can bridge the financing gap, then we only have to rely on PPPs. But as we rely on them, we must make sure that our legal structures are sufficient to protect our interests. Our legal structures are sufficient to create more transparency. Our legal structures are sufficient to enable us go after those that are complicit in helping these private companies evade tax and contribute towards corruption in our countries. So by strengthening our systems, we can create for ourselves an opportunity to have PPPs come in a safe way that provides for efficiency, but also provides for an opportunity to reduce some of the gaps that I raised. What is your take on the emerging narrative that MLIs like IMF represent interests of former colonial powers to recapture Africa through FDI? I must say that even over all the years that we have been trying to attract FDI in Africa through tax incentives, through PPPs, through borrowing, we have still not succeeded. And therefore, I must say that even as we think about these questions, I think there's a huge opportunity to discuss that. UTL, MTN, government's capital are contracted to foreign governments, state-owned, like, yes, China. You know, it's a private company, but it's backed by the government. Is it really a private entity? And that takes me back to the imbalance of power. Maybe John, if you want to come in. John, you are not muted, so you can speak. Yeah, maybe as we wait for John, there's another hand. Lanmo. Lanmo, please come in. You already unmuted.
Very much for such a presentation, and I've learned a lot today. It's just that issues of private public partnerships, and we are more like on the crossroads. They say that one way or another we need to do it. At the same time, there are challenges if we do it. If we don't do it again, there are other challenges. But my question now is, how then do we balance issue of affordability, like to general citizens? Because remember, you said for private companies, they seek profit, whereas the government would want to provide maybe public service which are freely available, or if they are to be paid for, they are paid at a minimum price. How do we balance the two? That is number one. Then number two, what is it that can we do as youngsters, as youth, or as civil society to make sure that we have a transparent and accountable private partnership deals, so that somehow we are involved in decision making, or we contribute or influence the policy? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lanmo. I must say that even as we wait for the next question, is even within civil society, and I thank SEATINI for organizing this forum, is that there's little understanding of how PPPs work and exactly which projects are PPPs within our countries. So we see roads, we see ports being built, we see power being generated, and we suddenly have generators all over our cities, but we don't understand as to how are these projects coming into our countries. And as they come, I must say that we must make sure that we do not create more opportunities for rent seeking. We do not create more opportunities for corruption. We do not create these opportunities. And one of the ways is by understanding the PPP models, understanding that as companies come to invest, we do not just assume that it is an investor. We question, or we analyze, or we interrogate, or we research on the existing contracts. We ensure that we understand which contracts are existing, how they were arrived at, who the players behind those projects are. And we do not just see FDI as FDI. Some of it is not just FDI. Some of it is investment that is not very clean. It is investment that has been entered into through private, public-private partnerships, through very cryptic agreements, through agreements that do not cater to the needs of our citizens, through agreements that do not balance the interests of our countries vis-a-vis the interests of the investor. And therefore, I will still say it again, sunlight. We must know who is involved, what are they agreed upon, what is the denomination of how we are going to pay those the money that is invested, who is backing these entities, what guarantees do they have. Now, give an example. We once were interrogating a power generation agreement, a geothermal energy project somewhere in Olkaria. Olkaria is in the Rift Valley of Kenya. And we were looking at, why is this company that suddenly came into the play, suddenly having so much backing from government? It was almost impossible to touch them. They were displacing people. They were drilling those wells, sometimes in the night. They were bringing in, and this is within a national park, they were bringing in equipment into a national park without any due regard, for example, to the ecosystem of that area. And we were wondering, why is this happening this way? Until we were able to determine that indeed it was a PPP project, and it was backed by a guarantee from the government. It was also backed by a guarantee from an external government somewhere in Europe. And it is until we learned that there was a guarantee from another government that we were able actually to identify the leverage through which we could advocate for the rights of the citizens. We could advocate for the protection of the environment. We could advocate for a better way of approaching the rights, for example, the land rights of the people that were being affected by that project. I know that we didn't even discuss some of the effects that PPPs have had on health and the environment and the other rights of citizens, because I know that there are certain other considerations that, like the rights question, when we are talking about PPPs. The other thing is about open contracting, advocating for more open contracting between government and everyone else that government contracts with. Can we have more sunlight? Can we have more publicization? Can we understand these contracts? Can we understand who the players are? And that is why there's a big push even within tax justice players about beneficial ownership transparency, so that we can be able to understand who are the players, who are the people behind these contracts, who are the people that negotiate with government. Any other question? Yeah, I see you, Renee. I see your comment.
Maybe John.
Yeah, John, if you're able to come in.
Looks like her microphone is actually now off.
Yeah, John, if you have any problems with your microphone, you could also type your question.
At some point, Kirsten had unmuted his microphone and I had sent him a private chat. I don't know if he still has a question or comment. Nicholas. I guess not. John, I think John's microphone is still off. Okay, I see her microphone is now on. Joan, if you could unmute and share your question or comment. We still can't hear you in case you're speaking. Joan.
Yeah, maybe if I can respond to one of the issues raised by Andrew about the repatriation of profits, that this is indeed one of the other major downsides of the private sector, that when we enter into a deal with a private sector entity, where do they, for example, repatriate their profits to? Because if these profits are repatriated to other countries outside where the company is operating from, then we are creating even more problems, because at the end of the day, we need these resources within the country. We need more liquidity. We need the creation of employment. We need to have more finances that, for example, can go to, allowing our banks to be able to lend more. But most private entities, they will register in tax havens, I mentioned. They will look for countries where they know that their tax will be lower. And so by doing that, at the end of the day, these profits are repatriated to other countries. So do we have, for example, in our PPP agreements, in our PPP laws, do we put in safeguards that have a certain ring fencing mechanism that require certain profits to be reinvested in the country or to be left in the country, so that as we negotiate, we